in the final days of the campaign for the US presidential election between Democrat Kamala Harris on the one hand and Republican presidential candidate Donald Trump on the other. But there's one issue that Indians in America in particular are looking at when it comes to this presidential campaign, and that is the question of immigration. It's something that Indians have looked at very closely for decades together. There are almost 5 million Indians and Indian Americans who live in the United States. Several of them, of course, are going to live and work and study there on visas. But in the last couple of years, America has acquired a reputation for being one of the most difficult countries in the world to immigrate to. And this presidential campaign seems to have a great deal of relevance and importance for how immigration policy, especially towards highly talented and skilled professionals from India, will evolve over the next couple of years. Joining me now to decode exactly this, how the American immigration system has evolved, especially for Indians, what difficulties and challenges Indians in America face, and how this presidential election could impact those policies, is Yash Chaturvedi, who is a master's student at Georgia Tech and is also someone who follows American politics closely. Yash, thank you so much for joining us here on India Today Global. Could I ask you to begin by talking about what I was just referring to a little while ago, which is that America has acquired this reputation of being one of the toughest places to immigrate to for talented Indians who want to study there and then potentially go on to work there and build a life and a career there. Would you agree with that? Is it really one of the toughest places to immigrate to as a talented Indian professional?
Hi, Shashank. Thanks for having me. So, to start off, I think a lot of the difficulty stems from the competition. I mean, a lot of us know that many top universities are in the United States. Many top companies have their headquarters in the United States. So if you're looking at tech talent or anything adjacent to tech, especially, you see the US as a great destination to start your career or to further your career, which is where a lot of Indian master students or PhD students actually come from. They spend a significant amount of time working for first, and then they come to do their master's or PhD, right? So I think overall that's what it's seen as a way to boost your career, and that's why it's so competitive, because of course it's not just Indians. There's so many other nationalities vying for student visas so that they can get a leg up in the market, right? Overall, I know that tech is usually an industry where you're well set up to work anywhere in the world after some amount of qualification. So people see it as, even if I don't get to stay in the US for a long term, it's still worth it for me to get some sort of master's degree or PhD degree, which then I can apply my skills in the rest of the world. So that's the context, right? There are just so many Indians who see this as a viable opportunity. And of course, it's not a new phenomenon, right? We've seen generations of Indians like trying to go to the US for higher studies. Although I feel like the gap in terms of education resources is getting bridged more and more because we have more collaboration between universities in the US and universities in India now,
Right.
and more availability of education materials and so on. But I still think that people see it as a leg up in terms of your opportunities in the global job market as compared to being restricted to the Indian job market if you graduate from India, right? So that's the context. And it's just extremely competitive because a lot of Indian students vie for that opportunity. So I think in terms of recent statistics in 2023, we had about 130,000 F1 visas being granted to Indian students out of like about 4.5 lakh in total. So you can see that India's the most numerous in terms of the number of students who get F1 visas. So I would say that the main difficulty here is the competition within India, right? So I think the process of getting an F1 visa slot itself is extremely random. And then people have all sorts of consultants who try to get you a slot in exchange for money. You have like people who install bots to ensure that the moment a slot pops up, it alerts you. So a lot of different sort of tactics, lots of groups formed just for slot booking, which means that even if you're a meritorious student who's able to get an offer from a university, it doesn't necessarily guarantee that you'll get a slot in time for getting a visa appointment and then finally being able to take that flight. So I think that introduces a great amount of uncertainty, right? When exactly you'll get your F1 visa slot. So once you actually get your slot, I think the conversion rate is relatively high, like about 60 to 70% if you see like the trend in the past 5 years or so. So once you get an offer from a good university and then you're able to get a slot, I think there's less uncertainty in whether you'll actually get the visa approved. There are, of course, some students who don't get through, but of course, if you get from an accredited university, you're more likely that you will get the visa. So I feel like there's slightly less uncertainty. However, of course, like once you get into the US, that's when there's a lot of uncertainty about whether you'll be able to stay in the long term, right? So of course,
Right.
like the transition from your F1 visa to your working status occurs in two phases. Like the first is of course the H1B, which is like your worker permit sort of. So once you graduate, then you get sort of a 3-year permit to stay in the US, which you can then renew to get 3 more years, after which you can then qualify for applying for a green card, right? So I feel like in both of these pipelines, F1 to H1B and then H1B to green card, there's a lot of uncertainty because especially what I know more about is F1 to H1B, right? Where it's essentially a lottery where a lot of students just submit their applications every year. Um, you get 3 attempts to try for an H1B after your studies. So there's this period after the F1 called OPT, which is called optional practical training,
Yeah.
which I think after 2016 was extended further, right? So especially if you're in a STEM or STEM adjacent program, you get 24 months in addition to your 1 year of OPT. So basically for 3 years, you can then try to get an H1B, after which, unfortunately, if you're unsuccessful, you have no choice but to return, right? And also in this interim period, like before you get an H1B, you get like a certain days of unemployment buffer, right? I think it's about 60 days. So if you are not able to find an employer within those 60 days, unfortunately, you have to return. So overall, there's a lot of uncertainty because of these factors, where it's not really certain that even after you've come into the country that you will be able to get those job opportunities that you dream of, right?
Right.
And of course, I think employers kind of factor this in, that they have to stand up for you and they have to sponsor your H1B in the interim period. So many of them are not very keen to do that, particularly in the job market, which, as you would know, has been significantly impacted in 2023 and 2024, which means that it's been very difficult for students to find jobs and find internships in this market. And that has compounded like a lot of the uncertainty, which probably wasn't there in, say, 2020 or 2021, right? Where the job market was doing significantly better. So those contribute to the main sources of uncertainty, that even after I get an F1, which companies will want to sponsor my H1B visa? And then even after that, like, will I be able to retain my H1B status, or will I eventually get a green card? I think that's where people come to the US and they're not very sure about like how long they'll be able to sustain this. So I feel like um, what you started out with by saying that the US might be one of the most challenging places to like really set up your career and like make moves in as like someone who's a tech enthusiast. I think that's where it comes from, this amount of uncertainty because of the vast competition that exists.
Right.
Then finally coming to what you wanted me to discuss, right, about Trump and Harris. So the way I see it, I think skilled immigrants make up a relatively small part of the airtime which these candidates dedicate to immigration, right? Because I feel like the bulk of the discussion that happens is usually on, say, border issues, things like undocumented migrants, um, or like labor which comes in from like neighboring countries and so on. So I feel like that's where they're able to stoke up sentimentalities the most. That's where like sort of Donald Trump gets a lot of his voter base from, by sort of creating this image of these migrants taking away blue collar jobs, right? And I feel like skilled immigrants, or lots of, let's say, people who come in on an F1 visa are probably not sort of the minority group which these politicians can frame as like taking away jobs in the same way. So in that sense, both the Republicans and Democrats sort of see international skilled workers as like an opportunity, in terms of like they paint them as like an ideal minority, and they sort of benefit from the contributions of Indian workers, right? So I feel like both of them, in terms of Trump and Harris, have a softened stance on skilled workers coming from other countries like India. So I feel like in 2016, of course, Trump was quite severe on H1B visas and had a strong anti-immigrant stance in general, which I think has softened in this term, right? Where
Right.
in this campaign, where, as you mentioned earlier, Trump has said that anyone who's an F1 visa holder or diploma holder might qualify for a green card. Now, of course, this seems like a large promise, which is difficult to uphold because, of course, it has to pass through like parliamentary approval, and then in what form it actually gets implemented, like we have to wait and see, because it's a very significant departure from his earlier policies and his earlier campaign statements. Even though he claims that he would have liked to implement that in his previous presidency had he got more traction, although we can't really verify those claims, of course, right?
Right. So
In
Yash,
terms of Harris, I don't think there's been any sort of extravagant statements about like changes to this process, like in terms of reduction of that uncertainty of F1 to H1B or H1B to green card. I think Harris believes that there should be some sort of easier pathway to citizenship, although it isn't clear what steps will be taken. I think that's been the frustration amongst Indians for many years, that these things get talked about mostly as a way to enfranchise Indian voters, but or international voters in general. Um, but then there hasn't been that much like action on the ground to make things easier.
Right, and
But I feel like,
if Yash, if
yeah,
I could ask you
sorry.
one question on this, particularly because you were getting into the point I wanted to ask you about how a lot of the systems sometimes Indians particularly, and I think Kamala Harris said this when she was running running for president to begin with, which is that a lot of these quotas that are placed when it comes to the H-1B system or to the green card system do have a disproportionate impact on Indian professionals, because you have I think in 2023 it was 500,000 petitions were filed for H-1B visas, but there's a legal cap of around 85,000 H-1B visas that must be that can be given, and Indians of course constitute a big part of that. But of course the cap in itself therefore makes it much harder for Indian professionals to move to the United States. Green cards, of course, you were talking about briefly as well, but even that is something where there are country-specific quotas. Just to explain to our viewers, there are country-specific quotas for how many green cards can be given, how many employment-specific green cards can be given, and that again, it has been alleged in particular cases, is disproportionately has an impact on Indians and Chinese professionals, because they are the largest contingent of people who are looking to apply for these things. Kamala Harris in the past has said that she'll do away with them, but again, that's a big reform. But I wanted to ask you about this idea of unfairness, particularly that these quota restrictions and these caps that the government has come up with, that in some senses are fairly arbitrary. Do you think that it has unfairly impacted Indians? Is that a feeling that you share as an Indian America, or that people around you who are Indian professionals share that view?
I feel like, of course, like we as Indians feel like we have a major contribution in terms of the workforce, in terms of like not just the workforce within tech companies, but also often like higher levels of the leadership are slowly, you see more Indians and more representation from Asians in general, right? So I feel Indians have the sentiment that the contribution which we make to the country overall is growing quite significantly, and of course has been significant in the past like few generations as well, right? So in that sense, we feel entitled to sort of greater representation when it comes to these quotas. However, I think there is some proportionality that comes in, so it's not like blanket caps just on like each country gets as much. I think there usually are more allowances for India and China in terms of, okay, there are so many people who apply, and therefore we should give probably like more chances to Indians and Chinese in terms of like trying to divvy up all those 85,000 opportunities which you mentioned. But I still think, of course, this will fall significantly short. And of course, the allure of the US is only going to grow, regardless of how the job market is, because I feel like people make long-term bets when they consider educational decisions. So I think, therefore, even though it's proportionate, or even though there's an attempt to be proportionate, this is still likely to fall like significantly short of the number of Indians who require like F1 to H1B.
Right,
So I
and if I
think
could,
that's where the unfairness comes from.
Yash, and
Yeah.
if I could ask you, from your personal experience of having moved to the United States, have you personally seen a lot of cases where talented professionals who have wanted to stay on in the United States have had to go back to India or move to perhaps another country because of these caps and these restrictions?
Oh yeah, I think that has happened more of late, right? I feel like um, even in, let's say, the past 5 years, it was probably more likely that you get some job like quite
Mm.
quickly in, let's say, 2021 or 2020. Of course, like discounting the mitigation of COVID, right, where a lot of students didn't even come to the United States. But in those periods, the job market was doing better. So it was more likely that, let's say, you came to campus quite early on, you got something out of a career fair or by applying online, and therefore you're able to convert that opportunity. I think opportunities have been harder to come by in terms of, while companies are still doing things like career fairs and announcing jobs, the conversion rates are much lower now. I feel like there are fewer openings, there are sort of fewer people who hear back, and therefore you hear a lot of stories where people apply to 500 thousands of jobs and they still don't hear anything back, they don't get interview calls and so on, right? um, and I don't think that reflects on the candidate's abilities. It just reflects more on the changing dynamics of these companies and how many H-1B visas they're actually willing to sponsor. And I do know that in previous batches of graduating students, let's say people who graduated in 2023, 2024, I do know stories of people who tried very, very hard, couldn't get anything within like, 60 odd days of their college term ending, and therefore they had to make the choice of going back. Some students then see what they can do in terms of like, do they want to further their education somewhere else? Do they want to research at a lab? Or how exactly do they want to further their careers? But for many of these students, it does mean that at least for now, the US dream didn't really work out the way that they expected. So I don't really have statistics on this, but I do think that especially if you consider like all universities across the board, there would be a significant amount of anxiety of amongst like final year students about whether they can even get like good jobs in this market, because you don't just want like any job, you want something that will sustain you and make it worth you making this difficult journey. So I think in that sense it's getting harder and harder, and most students are unfortunately not being able to find something, and therefore like really struggling against that 60-day unemployment window.
Right. Could I also ask you then, you already set the stage for us, in terms of Kamala Harris and Donald Trump. But, just the point I wanted to ask was, if I could ask you to make it again, perhaps at the at the risk of repeating yourself, if I could make you do that, on this choice now as an Indian student in America. This choice that seems to be there between Kamala Harris and Donald Trump. Of course, as you were mentioning, Donald Trump was someone who cracked down on H-1B visas. He once called them the theft of American prosperity. That's his quote. He, of course, cracked down on H-4 visas, that are visas given for spouses of of Indians on H-1B visas for them to get work in the United States. Of course, then the Biden administration came in and made things easier, ease some of those restrictions, has tried to make broadly some other visas were open as well. Would you broadly agree with the characterization that the Biden administration has been, and the Democrats have been slightly more open towards allowing immigration? And if I may ask you then, if I could ask you to answer that, and then also perhaps answer, as an Indian student, who would you rather see win on November 5th in terms of just their promises and their potential impact on immigration? Do you think either of the candidates will really materially make it easier for you as an Indian student in America?
Mhm. Right. I think that's a very interesting point, right? Because I think many of us can tend to have a very black and white perception of these political candidates. But from my understanding, I feel like both Biden and Kamala Harris seem to be like very establishment candidates in the sense that they don't seem to promise any major reforms in terms of things that would significantly change the immigration landscape, right? It's more like I think especially the platform where Kamala Harris comes in, because her bid for presidency began so late after Biden dropped out, is that she doesn't really want to stir the pot too much. It's just more about implementation, right? I think that's where she comes in on immigration, where she says that I want to ensure that the border um, immigration process is implemented well, rather than suggesting something like out of the box. I think that's where I see her campaign going, where it's more about implementation as compared to suggesting things which radically change immigration policies. In terms of Trump, I see the same rhetoric which you mentioned about H-1B. There's new rhetoric this time, right? About like people from India and China graduating from the United States universities and then becoming sort of multi-billionaires, right? And when they go back home, which is again something used by him to say that we can give these people a green card. So I think with Donald Trump's rhetoric, it can be a bit volatile, but of course, when it goes through the parliamentary process, it balances out, and eventually, I think gets petered out to something like far more reasonable. So even if it might be really exciting as of now that oh my god, we might get green cards like easily, I think when if and when Donald Trump comes to power, that might actually not reflect what comes about, because there's so many different challenges that might come about to such a proposal. So, in terms of your question about who, as an Indian, like we should be more enthusiastic about, I personally think on strictly the grounds of immigration, there may not be that much of a difference because, of course, as I mentioned, there isn't that much airtime dedicated to immigration discussions. I don't think in this term Donald Trump is as severe on H-1Bs, although, of course, there are other things which he has threatened to do, right? For example, remove birthright citizenship, or make it a bit more difficult for people to get that in the future. So I feel like strictly related to Indian immigration or Indian students immigration, there might not be that much of a difference. I feel like what might influence Indians is the overall quality of life that these candidates promise in terms of welfare, in terms of the job market, in terms of job security. I feel like these other factors are more likely to come into play than strictly what these candidates feel about immigration, which I feel is not as much of a differentiator right now.
Right. Yash, if I could ask you one last question. In terms of, from your vantage point, what reforms do you think the American immigration system could use that would make it easier for it to attract high quality talent, would make it easier for Indian students like yourself to continue to build a career there? And if you could also point out for a little bit to us why it's been so hard to reform the immigration system in the United States, because we know that several people have proposed changes to the legal immigration system to attract more high-skilled people, but for some reason or the other, they don't seem to be working out very well. So could you talk about that, both what reforms you would like to see and what the challenges to those reforms have been in the past?
Right. So Shashank, this might be my understanding, but I feel the problem is more infrastructural than policy. So I think that, for instance, in India, I believe there have been talks of more consulates coming up. So I think Ahmedabad and Bangalore seem to be upcoming centers where like US visas can also be processed. So I think like just being able to handle the number of requests is probably going to be the biggest change, right? Where I feel like overall the pathway seems to be clear. It's just that the number of people who can make that pathway is like very limited right now. And I feel like more infrastructure to deal with that visa processing would make things easier. So one is of course the infrastructural challenge. In terms of policy, I feel like some of these numbers, like say you get 3 years of looking for an H1B, or H1B like is valid for 3 years, after which you have to renew. So I feel like some of these numbers could be relooked at in terms of given the current job market and given how difficult it can be to find a job, what impact like it can have on your career when you have so much uncertainty. Can we be a bit more flexible about these numbers, right? I feel like those are some sort of policy reforms that could come in terms of the kind of bar which we have for green cards. Is that something that needs to be relooked at? So I feel like more understanding about like the difficulties of being an Indian student or just an international student, what would make it easier for us to contribute and like um, complete our degrees without thinking about jobs all the time. I feel like that kind of understanding might make it easier. So having more fallbacks in case you can't get an H1B, changing the clause of like 60 days of unemployment to make it something more flexible. So there's something in the interim, like where maybe you can skill yourself or maybe you get like some counseling. So basically, I feel while the pathway exists and of course infrastructure can be made better to support that pathway, I think having a bit more sensitivity to how difficult it can be, having sort of like more fallback options in case you aren't able to get something within that 60-day period. I feel like that would really ease a lot of anxieties. Which candidate is likely to bring these policies? I'm really not sure. And the problem, I guess, could be just in terms of the political viability of these things, right? Where it's not just about it being a good idea, but there needs to be enough political weight being put behind it to actually make it a priority. And I don't see that happening because even though, of course, like there's, I feel like while international students make up a big part of like the discussion around these universities, in terms of actual voter base, they may not be as significant, right? So I feel like for these things to become an electoral issue is going to take a lot more pressure and probably a lot more time. And I feel like that's the main limitation because, of course, like the main voter base who these candidates cater to probably aren't as sympathetic towards Indian students or international students, or they are not as numerous in terms of the voter base. So I feel like that's like those political issues might be the main deterrent to some of these fallbacks being implemented. But that's the way I see it, where even if there are good ideas in the making or there are good ideas being deliberated, they may not really come through because of lack of political pressure behind them.
Understood. Yash Chaturvedi, master's student at Georgia Tech, someone who tracks American politics closely, talking to us here about the challenges that Indians often face in America with the immigration system, as well as how the candidates would deal with this with the upcoming election, the Democrats as well as the Republicans, and also what reforms we could possibly hope to see when it comes to making it easier for Indians in America. Yash, thank you so much for sharing your perspective, and thank you so much to viewers for joining us on India Today Global.